In 42.2, we're going to be focusing on how energy moves through the ecosystems and also the major factors that control how much energy is going to move through. So, one important term to understand as we begin this section is that of primary production. This is essentially the amount of light energy that gets converted to chemical energy by autotrophs during a particular time period. And if you take a look at this, it's written in a very confusing way, but essentially this is the process of photosynthesis where we take light energy from the sun, and the chemical energy they're referring to is glucose. There are some ecosystems where chemoautotrophs are the primary producers, and those, once again, are autotrophs that use other chemicals, not light, to create those chemical compounds they can use as energy. But our major focus is going to be on our autotrophs. Now, the amount of light energy we can convert to chemical energy basically sets our budget for the rest of the ecosystem's energy. So if the plants are able to convert a lot of light energy into chemical energy, there's going to be more energy in the ecosystem. Whereas if there's less and the primary production is lower, there's going to be less energy for everybody else to use. The amount of light energy that reaches Earth's surface is very, very vast, because if you can think about it, the sun is hitting so much of the Earth's surface at one time. However, only a small fraction of that energy is actually able to be used for processes like photosynthesis, because only a small fraction of the light that's hitting the Earth is going to hit a photosynthetic organism. And of those photosynthetic organisms, there's only a small amount of light that's the right wavelength to undergo photosynthesis, because chlorophyll, the pigment in plants that absorbs the light, can only absorb certain fragments of the wavelength. So although we get all this light coming to Earth, there's only a small amount we can actually use. When we think about primary production, one of the measurements we can use is the gross primary production, or the GPP. And this is essentially the measurement of conversion of chemical energy from photosynthesis per unit time. So this is the total amount of chemical energy we get from light energy in a particular unit of time. However, what's much more useful to us is known as the net primary production. So this is essentially the gross, the total primary production, minus the energy used by those autotrophs for their own respiration. So the process of cellular respiration, basically breaking down glucose to use as energy, well, autotrophs, plants, can undergo cellular respiration as well. So for the net primary production, we're going to take the total amount minus the amount that primary producers use for their respiration, the RA, and that's going to give us the net, and that's basically how much energy is left for everybody else. This may be expressed as energy per unit area per unit time, so joules per meter squared times year. This is supposed to be a multiplication sign. Or biomass per unit area per unit time, so grams per meter squared times year. Both of those are acceptable units for net primary production. This, like I said, represents the energy that's available for all the other consumers in the ecosystem after the autotrophs have done all of their jobs. It is the amount of new biomass added in a particular time period, not the total biomass. So that's important to note as well. It's the new stuff. And when we take a look at our ecosystems, they all vary in the net primary production as well as their total net primary production on planet Earth. So places like tropical rainforests have very, very high production. They're producing a lot of energy in a very short amount of time. Open oceans, on the other hand, are an example of something that's not very productive. But because they are very large in size, they contribute a lot to the global net primary production because they take up a lot of our globe. Also important. So when we take a look at our ecosystems, they all give us different levels of primary production. So you can see here's our rainforest. They're producing a lot in those tropical areas. Part of that is because the sun hits really, really well right there. And then down here at the poles, you see there's a little bit less production just because we don't have a lot of sunlight hitting those areas. So when we look at primary production, we can also look at the net ecosystem production, which, as you can imagine, is the measure of the total biomass accumulated during a particular period. So this is the gross primary production minus the energy required for the respiration of all the other organisms in an ecosystem. So that's the RT. So not just producers like with NPP, but all of them. So primary consumers all the way up to tertiary consumers and those producers. The best way to measure net ecosystem production is to compare the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen moving in and out of an ecosystem. And you will see very shortly that these molecules are those that are produced and required for photosynthesis. So we can measure the movement of these molecules in an ecosystem to help us estimate the NEP. Then we can talk about primary production in aquatic ecosystems. So both light and nutrients control primary production in marine, aka saltwater, and freshwater ecosystems. And a lot of people would probably imagine that light it would be a strong limiting factor in a lake or an ocean, which is true because most of the light energy can only reach a certain depth, and then after that point, it gets very hard for light to reach. But if this were the only factor limiting light, we would notice some different patterns than what we do. So what we find is that there's actually a lot of nutrients that help limit the primary production in oceans and lakes. So a limiting nutrient is an element that is required for production to increase in a certain area. So if you run out of that element, you're not going to be having production occur. And in marine environments like saltwater, nitrogen and phosphorus tend to be the limiting nutrients in those locations. So, for example, nitrogen limits phytoplankton growth off the south shore of Long Island, and phytoplankton are our primary producers. And when they cannot grow, it affects the whole rest of the ecosystem. So we need that nitrogen. Now, there are several areas of the ocean that have low productivity areas despite high nitrogen concentration, but in those cases, a lot of times it's iron that is limiting in those ecosystems. So it kind of depends on the ecosystem and what they need, but it's not light that limits them so much as nutrients. When we take a look at our ecosystems in the ocean, there can also be an upwelling in some areas. And this is where we have a surge of nutrient-rich waters that really increases primary production in particular areas. Also, there's a process known as eutrophication, and this is when we have an addition of large amounts of nutrients to freshwater ecosystems like lakes. And a lot of times, you would think that the large addition of nutrients would be a good thing, but it actually tends to be poor because when you have a lot of nutrients, the organisms like the phytoplankton that depend on them might grow in number a huge amount. But then when those die off, it causes the other organisms that decompose the phytoplankton, for example, to release or to require a lot of oxygen. And then with the low oxygen levels in the lake, we start to lose fish species. And so scientists have found in recent years, especially, a lot of eutrophication is being caused by fertilizer being released into the lakes fertilizer and sewage runoff and that kind of stuff runs into the lakes and initially causes a high amount of nutrients, but then the organisms, as they get decomposed that benefited from those nutrients, deplete the oxygen, and then we start losing fish species. So eutrophication is initially seems good, but then it turns for the worse. In lakes, there's also a strong limitation on phosphorus. And so in oceans, nitrogen is more the limiting nutrient, but lakes, it tends to be phosphorus. And then now we can talk about land ecosystems and the primary production in terrestrial ecosystems. So when it comes to Earth and the land, the temperature and moisture are the main factors that control primary production. So the areas like we talked about, tropical rainforests, tend to be the most productive. We tend to look at the annual precipitation, which is, for example, water falling from the sky, so rain, snow, etc., and evapotranspiration. And this is the total amount of water transpired by plants and evaporated from the landscape. So if you recall back to biology, transpiration is when plants take up water from their roots, and then that water leaves, kind of almost like evaporates from their leaves. And then so evapotranspiration includes that, as well as the water that just evaporates from the landscape. And as temperature increases, we get higher rates of evapotranspiration, because you can imagine those water molecules are moving faster and they're starting to turn into a gas and leave. So this shows us a graph of the mean annual precipitation with the net primary production. And you can see the more rain we get, the higher production. So precipitation plays a big role. That's why the tropical rainforests produce so much. With nutrients, soil nutrients can limit primary production, and in terrestrial ecosystems, it seems nitrogen is the most limiting, but phosphorus can also be a limiting nutrient. So there are several adaptations that plants have grown to have over time. So they've evolved over time to possess adaptations that help them access limited nutrients in the soil. So one example are plants have a mutualistic relationship with bacteria known as nitrogen fixing bacteria, which help fix nitrogen into a form that plants can use. Many plants also have a relationship with different types of fungi, and those will help them fix those nutrients. The roots have root hairs that increase the surface area, making it easier for them to access these nutrients. And then many plants also release enzymes that increase the availability of these nutrients. For example, they can help speed up the chemical reactions that release phosphorus from other chemicals. And then they have that phosphorus that they need. So that is the end of 42.2.